like to thank Queers Against Israeli Apartheid for inviting me to speak on this panel. I've followed Quiet since its founding in 2008, and I'm humbled to be included on this panel speaking out against the co-option of our identities by those who usually don't identify as queer or trans and aren't invested in our well-being at all. Today, I'll be discussing a recent ad campaign launched by a former conservative party. The campaign employs women's rights, workers' rights, and queer rights in order to promote oil extracted from Alberta's tar sands as ethical. I'm currently based in Montreal, occupied Kandiyahi territory. I grew up in the industrial suburbs of Oshawa in a family of tradespeople, so I usually feel really invested in talking about workers' rights and queer rights. I'm queer and interested in environmental justice. I don't consider myself an expert on this topic. I'm just a queer person who got pissed off at some ads and wrote an article. Located in northern Alberta, the tar sands are the world's largest oil extraction project and thus one of the world's largest capitalist investments. The area of extraction covers an area roughly equivalent to that of the state of Florida. Tar sands consist of heavy crude oil mixed with sand, clay, and bitumen. Bitumen is like a molasses-like kind of sand goo. It's pretty gross. Extraction entails burning natural gas to generate enough heat and steam to melt the oil out of the sand. As many as 5 barrels of water needed to produce a single barrel of oil. While many policymakers want to convince us that the tar sands are clean, the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Rainforest Action Network, Greenpeace, who I'm not like super in love with, but their tar sands campaign is pretty solid. Environmental scientists and many others have spoken out against the project as the biggest environmental disaster on the planet. So who is Ali Khan Velshi and what is this campaign all about? EthicalOil.org is a campaign run by Ali Khan Velshi, who inherited the project from its original creator, political pundit and oil sands proponent Ezra Levant. Velshi is the former Conservative Party to Jason Kenney, formerly recognized by the state as the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, but I believe better known as the Minister of Censorship and Deportation. Velshi is well-spoken and can tailor any argument to sound very legitimate. He is known for his attempts to neutralize his opponents. An example of this is his very key role in preventing George Galloway from entering Canada. Of this, Judge Richard Mosley wrote that, quote, "One might hope a ministerial aide would exercise greater restraint," in a passage critical of Mr. Velshi's maneuverings. On the federal level, it's not legally seen as a conflict of interest for former aides to lobby for policy change, but he doesn't really need to lobby because, his friend, the Minister of Environment, Peter Kent, already uses the language of ethical oil in Parliament. The campaign features a series of YouTube videos, commercials, images, and blogs, all promoting the tar sands oils as ethical, in comparison to other nations he refers to as conflict oil-producing terrorist states. I originally felt inspired to write the piece after seeing a blog on Velshi's website entitled, "They Do Have These in Iran, and They Killed Them." This, of course, was in reference to Iran's president claiming there are no homosexuals in Iran. While I obviously would not condone mistreatment, abuse, or murder of LGBTQ folks in any part of the world, this struck me as yet another attempt of a political leader to use queer identities and bodies in order to push forward their political agenda. Much like Israel's co-option of queer identities and claiming it as a gay haven for queers in order to demonize Arab and Muslim people and states, Velshi is co-opting queer identities in an attempt to paint Arab states as terrorist nations from which conflict oil comes, in order to sell oil from the world's most unsustainable and dirty environmental disaster. So let's try to unpack what Velshi is doing. From here I'll discuss Velshi's claim of Canada's oil is ethical, the impacts the tar sands have on Indigenous communities in Alberta, and examine the history of conservative participation in queer liberation, and suggest steps that we can take part, do within our communities to resist this type of pinkwashing. So, who are the tar sands ethical for, and what communities are affected by tar sands pollution? While Velshi might claim that Canada's oil is ethical, it is no coincidence that Canada's relationship with Indigenous communities is completely left out of this campaign. The tar sands have polluted the air, land, and water in Alberta, including the Athabasca River, at a rate that is even higher than previously anticipated by scientists or government studies. While the government continues to claim that these toxins are a result of natural sources, independent study after study concludes that this is just false, as the water is much more polluted downstream from the development sites, so where the pollution occurs, everything flows into these communities. We are now finding 11 toxic metals such as mercury, lead, arsenic, and cadmium in the Athabasca River. Even small amounts of these metals are cancer-causing. From this, we see frighteningly high rates of cancer among Indigenous communities living in the area, specifically in Fort Chippewa, Fort McKay, and Fort McMurray. Exposure to the hydrocarbon sediments is felt by these communities, who have traditionally had rich diets of fish, moose, and birds that live in and around the water source. Moose particularly expose people to 33 times what is considered an acceptable amount of cancer-causing metal. Because of high rates of toxins in the animals and water, we can see a significant loss in native traditions and self-sustainability with the loss of fishing and hunting. People are no longer able to fish, swim in, or drink the water from the Athabasca River and are forced to seek alternatives. In some of these communities, 80 to 90% of their sustenance once came from the land. During a 2009 Parliament disruption by youth attending a climate summit called Powership, both native and non-native youth from across the country brought into public focus the government's unwillingness to sign the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At this time, Canada was one of 3 nations part of the UN who had not signed the declaration, which was drafted in 2007. They signed it eventually in 2011, although when it was signed, the statement they came out with was like, while this is a first step with working with Indigenous communities, it's not legally binding, just so you know. The truth is that, particularly if the DRIP was legally binding, Canada couldn't sign the agreement, not with its legacy of mistreatment of Indigenous folks in Canada. Many folks specifically point to the tar sands as a mega project, the mega project as a colonial process of environmental genocide. So what about these joyful tar sands employees? About the TV ads specifically taking aim with Saudi Arabia, they were aired on CTV for a while. Of these ads, Dave Coles, the president of Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union of Canada, said, quote, "I think it has racist overtones. I don't like it. I think it's a cheap, inappropriate approach. It was only a few years ago that Saudi Arabia was the savior of the world in the Iraq War. Oh, look how great they are. They are defending the supply of oil in the world. And all of a sudden it's unethical? That doesn't sit well with me. Oil workers, whether they work in North Africa, Chile, or Venezuela, are oil workers," end quote. Union leaders met with opposition MPs in Ottawa in September of 2011 to oppose the proposed construction of a Keystone pipeline from Alberta to the United States. Quote, "Most Canadians would be shocked if they learned the truth about our lack of energy security," end quote, said Gil McGowan, president of the Alberta Federation of Labour. Quote, "About 60% of the oil used in Ontario and the eastern provinces doesn't come from Canada at all. It comes from Saudi Arabia, Libya, and Venezuela. These are exactly the countries that Quebec and maritime provinces are relying on for the reliant share of their energy sources," end quote. Apart from that, my family members and I know a lot of people who go out to Alberta because it's so good for jobs, for tradespeople, and the rates of addiction and suicide for those workers is just so staggeringly high. It's just like miserable. And it just, a lot of communities, specifically native communities, are just like torn apart because, you know, like there's like a huge debate between like economic prosperity and like protecting the traditions and communities. So it's just not a good space for workers to be in. I also don't personally know of any queers who have directly benefited from the oil sands, but I don't usually rub shoulders with cis rich gay men who work in the oil industry. So is Canada actually a safe haven for queers? I'm sure it's obvious for many or most in the room that the Conservative Party doesn't actually care about our well-being, either at home or abroad. This is made clear by simply looking at recent history of Conservative roles in dealing with us. We can see, first of all, continued attempts to repeal same-sex marriage. I mean, I'm not super down with marriage as an institution, but like, fuck off. I mean, when you don't allow people to have rights of visiting their partners or the ability to come to Canada, like that's the only way a lot of people are able to do it. We need to have that. The second one is Jason Kenney removing LGBTQ presence from citizenship guides for new Canadians. This action is particularly, among many other things, hypocritical. I mean, he wants the entire world to know about to buy tar sands oil because Canada has an impeccable track record of gay rights, but at the same time wants to invisibilize us, like, at least be consistent. And of this, it was funny because Belshi, like, really stood up for him and was like, well, we didn't mention opposite, like, sex marriage either, we can't talk about every little policy Canada has. I mean, they also, I guess, thought it was really important to remove Canada's history of residential schooling from that guide. 3, appointing an opponent of same-sex marriage to the Immigration Refugee Board. Like, I'm sure that's really helpful for a lot of people trying to get refugee status. 4, conservatives overwhelmingly support the deportation of queer refugees and queer refugee claimants. 2 examples of this are 1, which is really popularized in the media here in Toronto, and Queers successfully rallied to keep Alvaro in the city, so it's amazing. He received media attention in 2000 when his refugee claim was denied because he, quote, didn't look gay enough, according to the adjudicator. Super relevant. Tonight, actually, where I live in Montreal, a queer man named Manuel Sanchez is being deported. He arrived in 2008 after having dated a police officer in Mexico. And when he tried to break off the relationship, his family, himself, and all his friends were continually assaulted and attacked by the police force. So there was a vigil last night, and anyways, my heart's with Manuel tonight. Along the same line, number 5, the induction into law, Bill C-31. A statement from Aztec, which is the Association Conservación Quebec, released a statement. One extremely problematic aspect of Bill C-31 is the fact that refugees who are identified as coming from safe countries would have their refugee claim fast-tracked with no access to appeal. One minister would have the sole discretion to designate these safe countries without consultation. Similar to, and sometimes overlapping with, gender-based persecution, the violence and persecution facing LGBTQ refugees are often comes from powerful individuals and groups they meet in their everyday lives. End quote. 6th example would be that all but 1 Conservative Party member voted in opposition to Bill C-389, which proponents would argue would protect trans citizens from discrimination in workplaces, housing, and dealing with cops. There is another bill kind of like that going through Parliament right now, which just passed its 2nd reading. 7th example I have is the ongoing cuts to social services, like sexual education programs in high schools, HIV/AIDS healthcare programming, and support services for non-status and refugee folks. So I'm sure everyone in the room knows it's not super fabulous to be queer and trans in Canada. Many of us struggle for survival, having trouble finding steady employment, housing, or access to support services that make us feel safe or respected. National Coalition for Anti-Violence Programs and the National Transgender Discrimination Survey show how trans women, people of color, Indigenous, queers, and two-spirited folks, people with disabilities, non-status folks, and street youth continue to be the most vulnerable populations to violent hate crimes or murder. People from our communities continue to disproportionately be incarcerated for committing survival crimes, locked away in dangerously misgendering prisons where they have little access to support or health care. And as we know, trans people are still required to submit to sterilizing surgeries in order to change the sex markers on RVs. Further, Canada is not a global safe haven for queers escaping violence and discrimination in our home countries, we just kind of discussed. Canadian immigration policies make it really difficult to claim refugee status and the types of homophobia or transphobia they experience through the refugee claimant process. So what can we do about this? As queer and trans communities, and I use communities in a plural form because we're really diverse, sorry to use that word, and not homogenous, and we have intersecting identities and abilities and needs. But we need to, first of all, reject the notion that Jasbir Kawar refers to as homo-nationalism. That is, we need to be queer across borders. We need to reject patriotism, challenge the invisible lines referred to as borders, reject assimilation into institutions that uphold white, heteronormative Western values. For example, rather than seeking to be out and proud in the military, we should be speaking out against racist wars fought over oil and paid for in blood. We need to reject the two-tier wage system that privileges upper-class white bodies and tell policymakers that if migrant laborers are good enough to grow our food, they're good enough to live here in safety and grow roots with their families with full access to healthcare and social services. Secondly, we need to reject white supremacist, racist, and body-policing ideologies and institutions that teach us to hate ourselves and each other. We must embrace popular education, skill sharing, and support networks that have always been staples to our survival as queer and trans people in a society that teaches us we're all going to die and disappear. 3, we need to be intensely critical of administrative bodies that make decisions on our behalf and in our best interests. For example, we need to question hate crimes legislation. Does the government really want to protect us, or are they using our safety as an excuse to build bigger prisons to lock us away in when we're forced to commit survival crimes? Are they taking responsibility for institutional oppression, or are they blaming a few bad apples? 4, we need to reject corporate citizenship. That is, we need to continue to fight for liberation struggles in our communities and spaces rather than making way for gay consumerism. Pride in Toronto and everywhere, especially Montreal, has been a great example of this. Most of us know that Pride is meant to commemorate a riot that began when trans women, people of color, and street youth rose up to challenge the police violence that threatened their daily survival. But now Pride has become a PR campaign where every corporation from Mac to Pfizer, the Israeli government, and the Toronto Police Department are given a platform to sell us their brand of citizenship that we're supposed to buy into. Like, I don't care about buying a Hummer and getting oil from the tar sands. I just want to live my life, you know? 5, we need to remember that we've never been given safe spaces or granted inclusion in into national institutions by benevolent government bodies. We fought for these things through caring for ourselves and each other, building support networks, and when we had to, by taking to the streets. We need to organize on a grassroots level, continue to engage in conversations that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our privileges, and that work towards creating inclusive spaces where we can all get together and talk about the people who try and fuck with us and plot our revenge. And the last thing I'm going to say is that we need to organize against xenophobic and racist laws that attempt to incarcerate, detain, and dehumanize queers seeking asylum in Canada. And currently this includes resisting C-31 and C-38.